speaking about the Catholic Women's League in South Australia, it is perhaps as well to begin by a brief description of the Catholic community in the early 20th century. Like those in the eastern states, Catholics in South Australia were predominantly of Irish birth or descent, and the majority of them belonged to the lower echelons of society. However, they were proportionately fewer in South Australia, 14% in 1911 compared with a national average of 23%. They were therefore much less aggressively Irish than other Australian Catholics, and traditionally have been more inclined to fit into the wider community. Generally, lack of money and status debarred them from participating in the more elite social life of the state. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the impact of superior schools run by Irish religious orders could be seen in a more educated strand of Catholics born in the colony. Nevertheless, there were still few Catholics in public life, and consequently those who were merited considerable prestige among their own community. They also had much more influence than the ordinary layperson with a hierarchy in clergy. From the middle of the 19th century, the Hibernian Australasian Catholic Benefit Society had been the dominant lay Catholic organisation. It provided for the social needs of Catholic men, as well as giving some financial security to their families. There had also been various literary societies designed to further the education and confidence of Catholic young men. But before World War I, there was no central Catholic organisation to cater for the needs of its women. By the early 20th century, several groups of church women were already active in South Australia, following trends in England and America. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Presbyterian Women's Missionary Union, and an Anglican organisation, the Mothers' Union, had all been formed by 1895. There was also the Young Women's Christian Association, supported by funds from prominent South Australian philanthropists. By 1913, this had opened a hostel for girls, and in 1914 was providing various classes for women: physical culture, science of womanhood, Bible and mission studies, singing and tennis. All of these church groups offered something to interested women: the opportunity to move outside home and parish circles, to meet a wider group of people, to develop latent interests or talents. For Catholic women, there were religious sodalities or prayer groups centred in the parish: the Children of Mary for girls and single women, the Sodality of the Sacred Heart for married ladies. They could assist in local church fundraising, or they could devote themselves to the relief of poverty by joining one of the two conferences of the Ladies' Society of St. Vincent de Paul. But that was the limited involvement outside the home. Education in convent schools, where they were taught to model themselves on the Blessed Virgin, chaste, obedient and self-effacing, did little to encourage worldly confidence in the average Catholic girl. Second only to Mary as a model were the nuns themselves. They had renounced the lure of worldly pleasures to become symbolic brides of Christ, and were thus seemingly on a higher plane than ordinary women. Therefore, many Catholic girls who remained in the outside world did so with a sense of having chosen the lesser path to eternal life. It is understandable then that Catholic women, generally low in social status and less confident than others, were slower to organise themselves than women of other denominations. World War I provided the catalyst for the foundation of the Catholic Women's League in South Australia. This took place in October 1914 with an inaugural membership of 150. At the time, there was only one Catholic president in Australia, the Catholic Women's Association, founded in Sydney in 1910 with a membership of 5. In August 1914, the outbreak of war in Europe had brought activity from almost every organised group in the state, all anxious to prove loyalty to king and empire. But reports of Catholic activity were missing. Although it was important to many Catholics in the state to demonstrate loyalty to Britain, there was no appropriate central organisation for doing so. The opportune moment was seized by a small group of middle-class Catholic women with good reasons for wishing to upgrade the Catholic image. They recognised too that in serving the needs of church and society, they could also establish for themselves a permanent identity. The founder of the Catholic Women's League in South Australia was a Miss Betty Leeworthy, an intensely patriotic Englishwoman and a convert to Catholicism. She said later, "The sudden demand for Belgian relief work enabled a dream of some years standing to be realised, the desire having arisen through reading an article in the English paper The Crucible of 1909. War work afforded us an opportunity to begin our new society for coordinating the social activities of Catholic women." It is probable that the presence of Lady Galway, Catholic wife to the Protestant Governor Sir Lionel Galway, and the involvement of three South Australian Catholics in the political world influenced the bishop towards granting permission for the League's establishment. There was Irishman Patrick McMahon Glynn and South Australian-born James Vincent O'Loughlin and Lawrence O'Loughlin, all with long careers in state or federal politics. Dr. Robert Spence, the new coadjutor Archbishop of Adelaide, who gave his permission for the League's foundation, later proved himself to be ultra-conservative in his view of what women should be allowed to do. But in wartime, the image of Catholic loyalty needed to be visible, and the few lay people at the top were quick to recognise this. Patrick McMahon Glynn, a lawyer as well as a federal politician, had addressed a Liberal rally in Sydney before the federal election in September 1914. "I am an Irishman and a home ruler to the backbone, but when the empire is in danger, nationalist and unionist stand shoulder to shoulder and march one way." During her time in South Australia, which coincided with the war years, Lady Galway was in fact one of the foremost leaders of women in the state. At the outbreak of war, she had immediately established the Red Cross and began working for the relief of Belgian refugees. She was a highly intellectual woman as well as an energetic one, publishing several literary works during her life, including her own memoirs, The Path Revisited. The Lady Galway Belgian book, a collection of essays written for her by public personages, was published in South Australia free of cost and sold in aid of the Belgian Relief Fund. As a Catholic, she was unable to take the position which traditionally belonged to the Governor's Lady, that of President of the Anglican Mothers' Union. She became instead an unofficial patron of the Catholic Women's League, giving Catholic women new status among the elite who gathered at Government House to organise the work of voluntary women helpers. Leadership of the League was almost entirely the prerogative of middle-class women. While its founder, Betty Leeworthy, a teacher, was the first honorary secretary, the inaugural president was Abigail McMahon Glynn, wife of Patrick the politician, and daughter of wealthy Melbourne businessman John Diamond. An educated and well-travelled woman, she had been favoured on one of her overseas trips with a private audience with Pope Leo XIII. Her long involvement with the League, she remained its first president until retirement in 1926, indicates that she was glad to establish for herself an Adelaide identity, apart from that of politician's wife and mother of a large family. At her retirement, the presidency of the League passed to another parliamentary wife, Blanche, wife of James Vincent O'Loughlin. She also remained in office for several years. The presence of Abby McMahon Glynn, Blanche O'Loughlin, and Mrs. Lawrence O'Loughlin at the inaugural meeting of the League suggests that there were indeed political as well as other interests to be served by this first central gathering of Catholic women in the state. Subsequent parish meetings to establish local branches were described as gatherings of principal Catholic ladies. In other words, they came from middle or lower middle class families. It is interesting to note that at Theberton, where all Catholics were working class, lacking any kind of influence, there was no gathering allowed by the Irish priest in charge, Father Healy. Nevertheless, Theberton did have a representative on the First League Committee, a Mrs. Mary Zeltner, an orphan educated by the Sisters of St. Joseph, an ex-governess and daughter-in-law of early German settlers. Her presence reflects the deferential support which was forthcoming from the ordinary women who made up the majority of the League's membership. But she too would have had an obvious interest in demonstrating British patriotism at a time when German names and ancestry were suspect in Australia. A significant feature of the League between 1914 and 1950 is the extent to which single educated women, the majority of them teachers, were responsible for its vitality. From 1914 until the post-World War II period, these were among its most able and dedicated leaders, holding office for several years at a time. For instance, Miss Rose Donnelly was General Secretary for 13 years, Vice President for 4 years, and President from 1937 until her death in 1938. While another single lady, Miss A. Flaherty, was Chairman of the Hostel Board for 18 years. In 1935, 4 out of the 5 executives of the League Council were spinsters, as were 3 out of 5 conveners of major League activities. The length of time that most executives remained in office reflected their enjoyment of their leadership roles, as well as the relatively small number of Catholic women able to take on the responsibilities assumed by its early leaders. The League's outstanding contribution during World War I was the erection early in 1916 of the recreation hut at Keswick Hospital for returning soldiers. Paid for by money raised by CWL, it was furnished by the State Schools Patriotic Fund, an example of cooperation between Catholics and school authorities. probably brought about by those League members who were also teachers in the state school system. By March 1916, the League had a membership of 900, an increase of 600% on the inaugural membership. This must say something about the British loyalty of South Australian Catholics, as well as the desire of women to be involved outside home and parish. Archbishop Spence expressed his pride in the League's achievement. A quote from the Southern Cross: "The work done for patriotic funds had placed the Catholic body in South Australia in a position it had never held before. Any national organisation could come to the CWL from whom they would expect a great deal of help, and from whom, he was glad to know, they would get it." It was a great comfort to him to be able to congratulate the League upon the building of the Keswick Recreation Hall. That was an effort that would bring glory on the League. A Jesuit priest, Father Connell, commented later in 1916, he was glad the League had taken its part in such work, for they must admit that Catholics, whatever they had done individually, had not collectively taken their due share of civic work. It was this image of Catholics that the League set out to counteract. The years 1914 to 18 were filled with Red Cross work, knitting and sewing for soldiers, hospital visiting, fundraising. There was an astonishing proliferation of badge-selling days: Australia Day, Wattle Day, Navy Day, Red Letter Day, Violet Day, French Comforts Day, Bird Button Day. All these activities helped to break down sectarian barriers, at least at the level of leadership, by bringing organisers into constant and friendly contact with women of all denominations. The foundation of St Mary's Hostel, primarily but not exclusively for Catholic girls, was an important achievement of the war years. From 1916 until its closure in the 1960s, when young workers and students opted for flat life, the hostel provided an important service to the community. This is particularly true of the World War II period, when the building was extended by government subsidy to cater for country dwellers coming to work in munition factories. Once the war was over, the League Council was loath to relinquish its civic involvement in order to aid Catholic charities in the way envisaged by Spence when he had said, when the need for patriotic efforts ended, the League would be able to turn its attention to home charitable institutions. The Catholic women of the period were not isolationist in the same way as their spiritual leaders. While Spence was wary of social intercourse between Catholic women and those of other denominations, fearing the thin end of the wedge, the CWL had established a rapport with the mild social activists of the day. They sent delegates to meetings of the Women's Non-Partisan Political Association and participated in various other joint activities. A committee of institutions interested in girls' welfare, discussions on the plight of Indians employed by the Colonial Sugar Refining Company, the establishment of the Travellers' Aid Society. But above all, they were committed to the preservation of traditional moral values and to the alleviation of social distress. The 1920s and 30s saw the heyday of involvement by League members in charitable and community work, in social gatherings and fundraising activities. They thrived on social problems. During the post-war migration of the 1920s, they tried to become surrogate mothers to young Catholics coming on their own to South Australia. Archbishop Spence suggested to them that they should encourage the Irish girls particularly to keep their mouths shut and their hands busy. The Depression years brought them representation on various civic committees: the Lord Mayor's Relief Fund, the Committee for Crippled Children, the Christmas Help Fund. There were two soup kitchens provided at the poorer Catholic schools, a registry to find work for unemployed Catholic women, an opportunity shop to subsidise the hostel expenses, pound days for the Little Sisters of the Poor, who ran a home for the aged, fate stalls for Catholic orphanages. But there was a dichotomy between, in the work of the League, in that fairly evidently the leaders did all the thinking and the organisation, and the main body of membership carried out the work. In addition to all this, Catholic schoolgirls were introduced to the Girl Guides, and junior branches of the League were established at various convent schools. It was anticipated that these latter groups would provide for the adult League the leaders of the future. Social functions gave Catholic women a chance to demonstrate their abilities as hostesses and their knowledge of church and official protocol. Described as brilliant or glittering functions, they were organised to celebrate various Catholic events of some importance. For instance, in the centenary year of the state 1936, there was an evening reception to visiting dignitaries attending the Catholic Education Congress. The VIPs got gold-lettered invitations, and the ordinary people got black and white invitations. From 1916, when on a visit to London, Abby McMahon Glynn had established contact with the London CWL, there was regular contact between the South Australian and the English organisation, particularly during the immigration from Britain after World War I. South Australian Catholic women were eager for involvement at every level. In 1928, at their instigation, the Australian Federal Council of Catholic Women was established, and 10 years later this organisation became affiliated with the international organisation now known as the World Union of Catholic Women's Organisations, popularly referred to in Catholic women circles as WACWA. Although many of its leaders, who'd been young women in 1914, had not been replaced by new members, the League entered the period of World War II still with a perception of itself as an organisation important to the success of a Christian-oriented post-war society. They had received new inspiration by the call to action defined by Pius XI in 1928 as being for the defence of religious and moral principles, for the development of a sane and beneficent social action under the direction of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, to restore Catholic life in the family and in society. However, it became apparent during the early 1940s, as the movement for Catholic action got underway in Australia, that the Australian hierarchy was bypassing such organisations as the League in favour of a national program for Catholic youth directly under its own control. The National Catholic Girls Movement of the 1940s superseded the Junior Catholic Women's League set up in the 30s and severed the connection between young Catholic women and the senior organisation. Thus, there was no flow-on membership to provide the anticipated new life as older leaders began to die or to resign. Changes in the national economy took many potential members permanently back into the workforce, while the onset of the boom years of the 50s and 60s lessened the obvious social needs which had given such stimulus to the League in its early years. The institution of mothers' clubs in the 30s and 40s by parents of children at Catholic schools obviously affected the number of younger married women joining the League. What happened to later generations of single middle-class women is more difficult to discover. It has been suggested that in the broader post-war society, the extension of opportunities for educated Catholic women to join wider-based organisations, the United Nations Auxiliary, the Penguin Club, the English-speaking Union, the Victoria League and so on, lessened the appeal of the CWL. But in any case, in the post-World War II period, the League began to stagnate, lacking goals, stimulation, direction, new membership. The 1950s thus saw the entrenchment of a noticeable dichotomy based on age and interest between the activities of Catholic women. Care of church altars and visitation of the sick became the prerogative of older women, while younger ones involved themselves in the needs of Catholic schools. Spiritual concerns, always an important theme in the life of the League, began to assume greater prominence as membership dwindled and became older and the need for practical work lessened. The emphasis on religious activities unconsciously reinforced the League's reason for existence in a changed world. From an organisation active in social welfare, it became, in the 50s and 60s, little more than an oasis of faith and piety in a world now perceived by church leaders as more materialistic than ever before. Long before Catholic action became the catch-cry of the Australian Catholic hierarchy, early leaders of the Catholic Women's League in South Australia sought to play an important dynamic role in the life of the church and indeed in a Christian society. They tried hard to exemplify their motto, charity, work, loyalty, in everything they did. They began by representing the loyalty of the Catholic body to imperial ties. They wished to go on representing the female portion of the church by an informed, skilled and united body, eager to share in the middle-class philanthropy which preceded the welfare state of post-World War II. They saw themselves as worthy upholders of the traditional values of family life, capable of holding on to and reflecting Catholic beliefs in the wider community. Everything they undertook during their first 3 decades showed that they had ideas, business acumen and leadership qualities equal to those of men. But in the church, they were far ahead of their time. Male ecclesiastics were not ready to recognise the claims of women to be anything more than a voluntary labour force, raising money, caring for altars, visiting the sick. There are frequent examples of the League's help and expertise being rejected or ignored by bishops and clergy. Many South Australian clergy did not want the League in their parishes. They saw it as one more religious society demanding priestly care and watchfulness, rather than as a body of people who could positively further the work of the church. Others did want them to perform the menial tasks of the parish. So clerical attitudes did little to halt the post-war decline in status and effectiveness of the League. This reached its lowest point in the early 1960s when membership dropped to about 300, despite the overall increase in the state's population and an increase of about 5% in the proportion of Catholics. The League really looked like dying out. Really, I'm trying to condense this last paragraph, but they didn't die out mainly because of the decree on the laity issued by the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s. This stressed the value of ecumenism and of the lay apostolate, and gave the bishops a good reason for taking more interest in such an organisation as the Catholic Women's League. And so, you know, with new episcopal interest and the new goals of ecumenism to pursue, they had reason to come back to life. And so I just didn't want to leave them there in the doldrums in the 1960s.
Well, we have a little time before lunch in which we can put questions to both our speakers, to Dr. Scarf on the Governor's Lady and to Mrs. Schuman on the Catholic Women's League. So if we can have some questions now, we'd be very happy. You know.
Mr. Schuman, the Archbishop Beovich, if I'm right, was very supportive of lay involvement in the church in other ways. It's fascinating that under his episcopate, though, the Catholic Women's League didn't survive. So was there a dichotomy between his attitude to senior male laymen, or senior laymen, men, as opposed to laywomen?
I think so. I did speak to Archbishop Beovich at the time, just before he died, when I was writing my thesis, and his attitude to women was very much that, you know, their important job was to pray and to keep the home you know, on a stable keel, and he was also the people that he could remember best were those with some status in the community, like Mrs. Britton-Jones occupied his memory more than the body of members.
The second question then, did the League ever get involved in party politics, or was it ever affected by party politics, and particularly during the period of the 40s when the movement, the embryo of the DLP,
No, actually, if you read the records of their minutes, this is one time when you can show how when it shows how they were stagnating. All this was going on around them, but the only active thing they did was attend a meeting in the town hall which supported a meeting, I forget what it was called now, but it was a very liberal meeting. It supported traditional values, and they attended that meeting. But other than that, if you read their minutes, there was absolutely nothing going on in the outside world, but bridge parties and perhaps festivals of art came later, but in the 1960s. Yeah, but from then on, you know, they lost impetus and interest in such things.
Dr. Howell.
Well, just one thing I think about the 1950s and 60s, or two things really. Many organisations were affected by the impact of television. And the second thing was that it was a period when there was quite a new swing to husbands and wives doing things together. And many single-sex organisations throughout the community tended to go into a decline. All the men's clubs throughout Australia started losing membership until the Adelaide Club got to a position where it had 150 vacancies. And and many places like the Athenaeum and well-known clubs interstate had to close because men were not going out on their own at night. And the same thing happened in church organisations. That rather than, there's a tremendous growth of organisations like the Catholic Life Movement and family movements and say the Catholic Graduates Association, where both sexes could be together rather than pursuing their own. I think that is a factor that had its impact on the League, just as it had on so many other single-sex organisations. If I could just say something about Dr. Scarf's paper, and that is that they might think I have a vested interest here, to be honest. I don't think that Lady Edith was by any means the only governor's wife who was more than a patroness. Lady Galway was periodically apologising for being more of a slave driver than a patroness. I think that really most of the governor's wives took a very active part in charitable and church organisations, and that there were quite a number who were perhaps even more distinguished than Lady Ferguson in those respects. One can only think, as I mentioned, Lady Tennyson's crusade to establish the hospital that's now the Queen Victoria Maternity Hospital against the united opposition of the medical profession. And her campaign for something to be done about the sweatshops in Adelaide, and how she was continually summoning Charlie Kingston across to Government House and saying, what are you going to do about this terrible exploitation of women making shirts for a halfpenny a dozen and John Martins is selling them for 2 shillings? And so on and so forth. And then there's Lady Buxton, Lady LaHunt helping to establish the kindergarten union. And really, this is not to denigrate Lady Ferguson in any way, but just to say that she was by no means alone in those activities.
Can I make a comment? It's just that I think that perhaps she was, in comparison with I appreciate what you say, it's of course very true, but I think in comparison to the governor's ladies who preceded her, that she was particularly active. And also within a very short space of time, she perhaps did a great deal. And I found that it's interesting that for a portion of the time she was there, she was pregnant, and I would have thought that a pregnant lady would have disappeared politely and not been seen. But here she was, obviously heavily pregnant, teaching in the school down at St Peter's Road. So I appreciate what you're saying, it's very true, but I think that she perhaps was an early active governor's lady.
I'm sorry, it tended to, what was the last part? No, I think that in World War I, that was the reason that the hierarchy was content for it to begin, because in South Australia particularly, the laity had always been very anxious to present a loyal face to the general public, and I think at the start of World War I, it was missing, and so with the politicians urging the bishops, and with Lady Galway, as the governor's wife, I think it was that pressure which gave the women an opportunity to begin. I think the loyalist image has always been welcomed in South Australia by the hierarchy. It's part of the Catholic ethos in South Australia.
I'd just like to continue a little bit on that same question. In the First World War, of course, what was quite momentous for South Australia was that it was part of the anti-conscription movement and carried the referendum in this state in both 1916 and 1917. Now there were tied up with the anti-conscription campaign many Catholics, certainly from the viewpoint of the Labour movement at any rate. I just wondered how that affected the women, and also the influence of Cardinal Mannix and his efforts in the anti-conscription campaign were quite widespread in South Australia.
Well, because I had to write my thesis from the minutes, mainly of that period, minutes of the Catholic Women's League on that period, and it is quite marked that there is really no debate in the League at all about the conscription issue. The only thing that came to light was that Miss Leeworthy, the patriotic, its patriotic founder, had on a Sunday distributed anti-conscription, pro-conscription leaflets in her district, and a question was asked at the meeting apparently, and it was glossed over, in a very charitable fashion, but the meeting evidently felt that each person had a right to their individual beliefs, and she wrote a letter to the Southern Cross defending her position that while the country had no objection to its sons dying on the battlefield on a Sunday, no exception should be taken to her trying to gain support for them on a Sunday. But by and large, you see, the leadership of the League was very liberal and conservative minded. The politicians, they were, and their wives obviously, were very concerned to uphold imperial ties and to be seen upholding imperial ties. So what those affiliated with the Labour movement felt about it really doesn't appear in the League minutes at all. But I rather suspect that the women just followed on, the ordinary membership just followed on deferentially doing the work and letting the leaders do the thinking.
If I may just take up the point that Mr. Moss just touched on, I think we would not be right in thinking the Labour movement is specially Catholic in South Australia. It's up to 1916, there's very little evidence of Catholic participation at the leadership level, and in fact evidence of hostility and difficulty with the hierarchy over the years, and there's a few token Catholics, but very much token. And despite the possible shift interstate to include more Catholics after the split in 1916-17, that's not in South Australia particularly obvious from my reading of the evidence, and so I think we need to be fairly careful about that. Given though, of course, that most Catholics in South Australia find their social level from the working classes. But that, I think we've got to keep in mind the sort of things that Dr. Hunt was telling us earlier about other groups in the community religiously as would find their place.
Did you come across any?
Well, I'm not sure this will entirely answer your question. Might speak around it perhaps. When Bishop Short came out to South Australia in 1847, December, he came out as a man who'd been educated in a high church tradition. He was an old-fashioned high churchman. Of the six clergy who had been here before, preceded him, 5 of them were thundering evangelical, low church, sympathetic to Protestant clergy. And he loathed and detested the wishy-washy, what he thought was a wishy-washy latitudinarianism, and he was not at all fond of the idea of common Christianity, which was so dear to so many Protestants in the colony, and had been espoused quite enthusiastically by a number of the Anglicans. In order to assert the identity of the Anglican Church against this wishy-washy latitudinarianism, which is what he called it, rather than me calling it, he started to emphasise aspects of Anglicanism that made it distinctive, and these just happened to be the particular attitudes and theology and views that coincided with this Anglican revival that was occurring in England. Now, added to that, as he got older, he became more and more interested in the Anglican revival, more and more delighted with ceremonial, so that his ecstasy in his diary over the processing surplice choir of little boys in purple cassocks and little white surplices at St Peter's Cathedral was great. He was this man in his late 70s who managed to see his cathedral get off the ground, and he delighted in all this. So his views about dissenters become stronger and stronger as his episcopate lengthens. What was your question?
Yes. I wondered if there was any evidence that you would like to see the Anglican Church as the established church.
Oh, I think perhaps nostalgically occasionally, but and there were certain financial benefits that obviously went with being an established church. But I think he realised, perhaps in his most negative moments, it was no good crying over spilled milk, and in his most positive moments, that one found this sort of thing quite an opportunity. It may have cost him some sleepless nights, but I think it was mainly in terms of fundraising. And I think at times that the disproportionate amount of time that ends up in the correspondence columns of the press about presidency, and who shall sit next to whom at dinners, and who shall say grace before and after dinner, suggested it occupied more of his time and mind than it really in actual practice did.
Thank you.